to someone else teach last week, but it was kind of weird at the same time. It feels good to be back up teaching again. All right, well, we've been working our way through Daniel for the past several months. So tonight and Lord willing, next Sunday night, we're actually going to finish this up. So just because it's been a couple of weeks, the first part of Daniel chapter 11, verses 2 through 24, showed us how that Daniel received a vision from this angelic being, and he receives word that really is just completely backed up by what happened in Scripture. When we look at the Scripture, what is said about prophets, whether something is a false prophecy or a true prophecy, is does it come to pass? And everything that Daniel was told was going to happen during Israel's history leading up to the coming of Christ happened exactly as was told to Daniel. And so we saw how for more than 400 years from Daniel's time leading up to Antiochus Epiphanes, who we're going to talk about this evening some, during that entire time, they were kind of stuck in the middle. The north was trying to conquer Egypt. Egypt was trying to conquer Syria. And they were just stuck in the middle, having to deal with all these different conflicts back and forth, as well as some problems that they brought on themselves. Well, tonight we're going to pick back up with Daniel chapter 11, verse 25 through the end of the chapter. And we actually see how two different kings are going to be talked about here as the primary emphasis. The first, we already started with Antiochus IV, also known as Antiochus Epiphanes. And he was going to be one of the last ones to really do significant things as a king of the north before Rome is going to rise to power. And so let's pick up with Daniel chapter 11, verses 25 through 30, and see how after he rose to power, after he tried to take over authority by marrying one of his daughters to one of the kings of the south, and that didn't work out for him. Let's see what else he did. Verse 25 picks up, and he shall stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great and mighty arm, but he shall not stand, for plots shall be devised against him. Even those who eat his food shall break him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. And as for the two kings, their hearts shall be bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail. For the end is yet to be at the time appointed. And he shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant. And he shall work with his will and return to his own land, and at the time appointed he shall return and come into the south, but it shall not be this time as it was before. For ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. So this actually describes a lot of different back and forth between Epiphanes, Antiochus Epiphanes, who's the king of the north, versus Ptolemy VI, who is the young king that's reigning from Egypt. And so we've seen that constant back and forth between the two of these. But one of the things that we have to understand, this actually picks up the third time that Antiochus Epiphanes actually tries to take control of Egypt. The first two times he was not successful. He got a little closer each time. In fact, during the course of his reign, he invaded Egypt a total of 4 times and had varying degrees of success and everything. And so the first attempt, he was able to take Pelusium. After leaving a garrison there to take care of the territory, he himself retired to the city of Tyre. But then the next time he went against the northern African areas, he took Memphis and laid siege works at Alexandria. Well, remember, the king of the south that's ruling there, Ptolemy VI, he's just a child still. And so his advisors tried to get him out of country, if you will, to protect him. But one of the things that they didn't count on was that Antiochus would have a navy to be able to ultimately take control and capture this king. So this is still a boy, he's a king, but because he was captured, he was taken back with Antiochus and his territory. And so the Egyptians said, well, we don't think we're ever going to see this young man again. So they put his brother on the throne. So we see this constantly throughout history, how kings come and kings go. But because of the brother coming to the throne, notice the scripture said that the young king and the two kings, the king that was captured and Antiochus, they were going to lie to each other at the table. Well, this talks about a time when Antiochus began to treat this young boy as if he was an equal, and he tried to make things better for himself so that he could overcome Egypt in a different way. It didn't work to marry his daughter off. It didn't work trying to attack and just conquer the area. But since they have this boy, said, you know what? They put your brother on the throne. Isn't that wrong? And so he began to try and make this covenant to become allies with this young king and said, you know what? We should go back to Egypt, and I'll fight with you, and we'll take the throne back for you, and then your brother won't be on the throne. Well, think about this. You offer candy to a little kid, and they'll do just about anything, won't they? All right, you offer to give someone a throne and a kingdom, you know, how much easier is it to be able to say, yeah, I want to do that. So at the table, they're sitting here, and they're making these agreements, and ultimately they did go back to Egypt, and at this particular time, though he didn't have to fight to conquer Egypt, he put the young man back on the throne, and he was able to loot various towns of northern Africa and take the spoils back to his own kingdom to be enriched by it. So this is what this text is talking about this king of the north that would come, and the two would become one, they'd be allies. But it seems like every time someone makes an alliance, it gets broken somewhere along the lines, doesn't it? So when the young king is back, he's got his throne back. Ultimately, he broke the alliance that he had with Antiochus Epiphanes. He joined forces with his brother, who had been the one that he had come to take power back from in the first place, and they went against the forces that Antiochus had left there and were able to be successful for a time to keep him at bay. Now, in this whole time, we begin to see the Empire of Rome starting to rise to power. You know, this started with the Babylonian Empire. It went to the Medo-Persian Empire, which is where we see Daniel receiving this vision. Talks about the kingdom of the Greeks through Alexander the Great. The kingdom was divided between the generals, and that's why we keep seeing this back and forth. But one of the things that we see is that Rome is starting to become a power, and so it says that they needed help. Well, the ships that came for Kittim were because these two brothers said, we can't defeat Antiochus on our own. They realized that, so they sent word to Rome to make an alliance to see if they would help them. And that's when all of a sudden we find Antiochus Epiphanes in Alexandria. He has his army, he has his siege works. He's ready to try and conquer Egypt one more time when the Roman navy shows up and says, if you don't cease and desist and leave, you will find yourself fighting not just them, but Rome. If you remember from last time we studied it, there were others from the north that tried attacking Rome and they got pushed back. They remembered, I think, what happened the last time that they tried to fight against Rome, and so he did. He withdrew back to his own territory. But if you notice something else about what Daniel was told, it said that all of a sudden his eye would turn from Egypt to the Holy Covenant. This wasn't the relationship that he had established with the king of the south. This is literally talking about the Jewish people. After he realized he could not conquer Egypt, he said, well, there is another wealthy place that we can attack, and that's the Promised Land. The temple still had great treasures. They still had all those golden utensils that were used in the worship services. And so he turned his eye back towards the Promised Land, toward the Jewish people, to be able to conquer them. All right, so Antiochus is constantly trying to attack, trying to do something. Now his attention is turned back toward the Jewish people. But again, we have to understand something else going on in the background. So this is mainly showing us what's going on between the north and the south. So the Jewish people we know are stuck in the middle, but what's going on with them specifically? Well, during this man's reign, there was a man named Onias III, and he was the high priest in Jerusalem. He was leading the Jewish people in worship. Well, all of a sudden, we see a lot of people turning from the true faith, and that's why it says later on that they turned from the Holy Covenant. And all of a sudden, there was a younger member of this man's household that says, you know what? I bet if I offer a big enough bribe to Antiochus, he'll make me the high priest instead of this guy. And so that's exactly what happened. He offered a bribe to Antiochus, and so he began to diminish the worship of the Jewish people in Jerusalem. And so he was able to bribe his way to have Onias III ousted, and he was able to become the new high priest. Well, another one of his brothers decided it worked so well for him, I want to be the high priest. So he offered a bribe to Antiochus again, and Antiochus, he didn't care. He's got an empire to rule. He's got conquest to plan. If you want to give me money to make me richer, to make my kingdom wealthier, sure, you can have whatever you want. So he made a bribe, and this was Menelaus. And so Menelaus offered a bribe. Antiochus said, that was fine, give me the money, you can become high priest. So to pay for the bribe, he took treasury items out of the Jewish temple, sold them to get the money to actually pay Antiochus for this new position. So none of this sounds like the kind of person you'd want to have lead in worship, does it? But yet this gives us the background to understand as he turned his eyes towards Jerusalem, he really wasn't concerned about them. All he was concerned about was having power and gaining greater wealth. And so we see all this taking place. Before we get into verse 30, Albert Barnes makes this comment. He says, here's the deal. When he, Antiochus Epiphanes, was in Egypt, a report was spread abroad that he was dead. In consequence of this rumor, Jason took the opportunity to recover the office of high priest from his brother Menelaus, and with 1,000 men took Jerusalem, drove Menelaus into the castle, and killed many whom he took for enemies. Antiochus, hearing of this, supposed that all the Jews had revolted and determined to inflict summary chastisement on them on his way to his own land. So what happens? He hears, every time you hear something, you need to verify it. Well, we see that too here. Antiochus is trying to fight Egypt. He hears about what's going on. It all started with rumors, didn't it? Jason first bribed to become the high priest. His brother bribed to become the high priest. There's a rumor that the king is dead. So Jason says, I want to be high priest again. So he literally gets an army together to go after his brother. Doesn't kill his brother, but he kills a lot of other Jewish people in the process that it said he thought were enemies. And so because of all this, word got back to Antiochus as he's coming back from Egypt. He's already upset. He's lost the battle once again. He's not going to get to rule over Egypt like he wanted. And so because he hears of this uprising, he just assumes that everybody's against him, and he goes to make war against the Jewish people. And so that's why what Daniel is hearing about is exactly what happened in history. Well, let's pick up the second part of verse 30 through 35, because we read more about the specific type of persecution that Antiochus Epiphanes brought against the Jewish people. So Daniel's told in verse 30, it says, he shall return back and pay attention to those who forsook the holy covenant. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering. And they shall set up the abominations that make desolate. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. And the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. When they stumble, they shall receive a little help. And many shall join themselves to them with flattery, and some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. So this is drawing an end to the teaching about what's going to happen to Antiochus. And so what it tells us is when he turns back to Jerusalem, he didn't want to just go inflict injury on them. He wanted to just take away their way of worship as a whole. So that's why when it says that he came back to them, and all of a sudden he forced his way to profane the temple and the fortress, what we know about him is that there were a lot of Jewish people who had accepted that Greek culture that Alexander had tried to bring everywhere he conquered. And so when you read in the New Testament about the Hellenistic Jews, those are the ones who liked the Greek way of life. They enjoyed the Greek way of culture. And so they became, if you want to use today's terms, they were the more liberal side of the Jewish people versus the more conservative who held closer to the teaching of Scripture. And so there was a considerable part of these Jewish people, and he says that those who forsook the Holy Covenant, those were the ones that he tried to pull into his side. Those are the ones he tried to entice with flattery. And in fact, when he came to Jerusalem, how he profaned the temple was that he robbed the temple of all the riches. He brought them for himself. But he also set an altar for false worship in the temple courtyard. And ultimately, he also built an idol to worship Zeus in the temple set apart to worship God. Now, when it says that all of a sudden there was this abomination that made the place desolate, remember, if they don't have the priesthood, they don't have the proper items for worship, they can't have the burnt offerings. So that's why it says the burnt offerings ceased to happen. They ceased to take place during this time frame. But it was also a place of pagan worship. Those priests that had bribed for the opportunity to be the high priest encouraged this type of thing. But we also see that pigs were considered an unclean animal. So what was it that absolutely desecrated the temple as a place of worship, but to bring a pig in and offer it as a sacrifice? And so in every way, this man didn't just want to get even by putting people to death. He attacked their way of worship. He attacked the people who led the worship. He desecrated their place of worship. And so we see that this was a terrible time for those Jewish people who held firm. Now, like I said, there were some who said, you know what? You roll with the punches. This is the new king. This is how we worship. Let's just enjoy to the best of our ability what we've got. But notice it said those who knew their God stood firm and they fought back. We learn from that writing in between the giving of the Old Testament and New Testament. It's not Scripture, but it's called the Apocrypha. And one of the books that's in there of these Jewish writings is a book called First Maccabees. And it describes how the Jewish people had those who knew God, who stood firm for God, and how they rose up against this man and those who were trying to lead this false worship in the temple of God. And in that book, First Maccabees chapter 1, it says that Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and everyone should leave his laws. So all the pagan agreed according to the commandment of the king. Yea, many Israelites consented to this religion and sacrificed unto idols and profaned the Sabbath. So you think he got what he wanted? You know, all of a sudden he's got these Jewish people. Well, if I can get them to worship like me and act like me and talk like me, then I don't have to worry about them. And so that's exactly what began to happen among a lot of these people. It wasn't until we see the Jewish sect known as the Hasidim, which is translated to godly, pious, or loyal ones. They were led by a man named Mattathias, and he was the one who was the father of the Maccabees, who led a revolt of the Jewish people against these false teachings, this pagan worship, and all that was going on. And so when it says that all of a sudden there was a little help for these, it talks about how the Maccabees were able to raise up this Jewish army to lead this revolt against all that was going wrong in Jerusalem. James Smith in his commentary makes this comment. He said, the faithful described in the text formed the core of what became known as the Pharisees in the New Testament. So these were those who wanted to restore the full teaching of the Old Testament law. They wanted to restore the worship according to the Old Testament law. And so it was this family unit that began to really stand against everything that was trying to destroy the people, their way of life, and even their way of worship according to the Old Testament. So that draws us to the end of what Daniel is told about the kingdoms of the north and south. Now, the rest of Daniel chapter 11, where we'll spend the rest of our time this evening, beginning with verse 36, begins to talk about an arrogant king that came to power. Now everything else up to this point has been telling us about the king of the north and the king of the south. It's been talking about the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. But when we get to Daniel chapter 11, when it says that there's an arrogant king that arises, I want to be fair right from the bat and tell you, depending on what you study, the study Bible that you use, the commentaries you look at, there's really three different ways that this passage is interpreted. Made it really confusing when you start studying it. I spent, I think, the better part of a week just on this passage. Now, the reason I say that, because you need to understand what's going on. There's one group who teach that everything that's being talked about, it's almost like it goes back and just summarizes everything that was just talked about. So some take the rest of this chapter as a summary of, well, I just told you what was going to happen under Antiochus Epiphanes, and this just summarizes it all in one fell swoop. But the problem is the details don't line up. It's going to tell us about the kind of faith that this particular king had and the things he did, and it's just not going to line up with the text. So then we move on to the next way it's translated. Well, everything we've looked at so far that Daniel was told was going to happen was chronological, wasn't it? Starting from Daniel's time, moving forward, we've seen how all through the historical documents outside of Scripture, they proved what God had told Daniel was going to happen. They were all chronological events. So the problem is that the next group of people look at this and they say, well, we're going to go 2,000 plus years into the future, and we're going to interpret the last part of this, the arrogant king, as if he is the Antichrist that's talked about in the New Testament, and that any war that's talked about is modern war, not things that have already happened. Well, the problem is everything that's been talked about so far were chronological events. This happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. It's all pointing to the end of the Old Covenant and the coming of the Messiah. And we're going to see that next week when we close it out in chapter 12, Lord willing. And so this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense of the text either. But again, depending on the translation and a lot of study Bible notes, when I looked at my own study Bibles and you look at the little notes at the bottom, this is the way that a lot of modern study Bibles interpret it for you. So there's another alternative. And believe it or not, it's not the one that's promoted the most, but it actually makes the most sense of the text, and it falls right in line with historical documentation. So who is the arrogant king? Well, based on the things that actually happened from the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, the rise of Rome, and the coming of the Messiah, what we read about in the last part of chapter 11 actually most likely refers to Herod the Great. Remember the Herod that was reigning when Jesus was born? That was the Herod that this is talking about. He was a very arrogant man. Let's get into the text and we'll talk about how arrogant he was. Well, he reigned from 40 to 4 BC. So those last few years of BC leading up to the birth of Christ, and then the growth in ministry of Jesus. And so Herod's rise to power was actually because of the time he had spent and the authority he had in Rome. He was of Jewish blood, of Jewish ancestry, and like a lot of other nations, they used people from within the different people groups that were part of their empire to rule over those people. Because if you have someone that's like yourself, thinks like yourself from the same background, there's a whole lot more opportunity that they're going to listen to that person than this foreign dictator, aren't they? So we see as Rome rose to power that there was a lot of different connections, and Herod had spent great amount of time in Rome before becoming the king of the Jewish people. Well, Daniel 11, verse 36 through 39, gives us the first information about this new king. It simply says, "And the king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done. He shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers, or to the one beloved by women. He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. He shall honor the god of fortresses instead of these, a god whom his fathers did not know. He shall honor with gold and silver and precious stones and costly gifts. He shall deal with the strongest fortress with the help of a foreign god. Those who acknowledge him, he shall load with honor. He shall make them rulers over many, and shall divide the land for a price. So notice from the very get-go, it doesn't say this is a king of the south. It doesn't say this is a king of the north. This is a new kind of king altogether. And so when we begin to get into this text, this entire section deals with the king as one who is separate, a new king. Everything so far has been focused on the progression of time. Well, we remember those earlier visions and dreams that Daniel interpreted. It all talked about how the Babylonians would come to, there would be another empire, the Medes and Persians, then there would be the Greeks, then there would be the Romans. And so each of these would do something different. And under the Roman Empire, we see that a lot of these kings were raised up from among their own people. And so this is the same thing that happened with King Herod. He was given power to rule over the Jewish people by Rome. Now, this king also reigned until the birth of the Messiah. It's talking about the end of the indignation, the end of the time when God would be judging his people for their pagan worship or constantly turning away from God, which led to that first imprisonment in slavery, if you will, from the Babylonians, and how it kept on through all these other empires. And so he keeps talking about how there is coming a time when it is set and God was going to bring this indignation for the Jewish people to an end. Well, that was the coming of Christ. It was the new covenant that was established in Jesus Christ. It was the hope of salvation, not just for the Jews, but for all mankind. And so this particular king did rule all the way through the birth of Jesus and a little bit beyond that. Something else about Herod the Great, he paid no attention to the other gods. It talked about how he was arrogant, he was puffed up, he thought just about himself, and history reveals that's exactly the kind of man that King Herod was. It said that he didn't worship the God of his fathers. Well, remember, this is a Jewish man. The Jewish people took their ancestry serious, and the God of their fathers was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But Daniel was told very clearly that this king will rule, he will have authority, but he's not going to worship the God of his fathers. In fact, the God he worshiped, they never even knew. Well, there was a reason for that, because he would completely honor the Romans in every regard. And from Julius Caesar on, the Roman emperors considered themselves a god. He gave much tribute to them. And so as it said at the end there, it said anyone, in fact, that wanted honor, anyone that he thought would be able to support him, he would give them greater honor than they deserved, just so that they would be on his side, and he would give them different land. He would give them honor. He would also help them out financially. So we see these different things taking place. Something else that we see in the life of Herod the Great, it said that this king would despise the desire of women. Well, not all women desired this, but think about ancient culture. What was it that a woman, specifically a wife, wanted more than anything else? What did she desire? Children. So when we think about this passage, it says that this particular king would not have any regard to the desire of women. Well, we see a glimpse of what's going to happen in the New Testament. When Jesus Christ is born, what was it that Herod the Great did? He tried to kill all the baby boys. What did the women want? They desired children. What did fathers want? They desired a son to carry on their name, to carry on their heritage. And so we see it's not just the desire of women, but we see this idea that ultimately he would be one who would not regard properly the desire of women. And so we know from history this is something. But it wasn't just the fact that Herod the Great tried to kill Jesus and all the little babies that might possibly fit into the category because he didn't know who this Jesus was. He didn't know who the new baby born King of the Jews was. But one of the things that we also learn from history, he had his wife killed. He had his children killed. He also had other relatives put to death. In fact, it was noted that Caesar Augustus once said, I would rather be Herod's pig than his son, because he had such a reputation for killing those close to him that just just irritated him in different ways, or that he thought were out to take his authority from him. And Herod the Great also was known for his massive building project. We'll see that a little bit more in this next passage. But the idea is that when we think about all the different details that it gives about who this king would be, the things he would do, the things he would be known for, it all matches right up with chronology with what would happen leading up to the birth of the Messiah. All right, well, let's look at verses 40 through 43, and we see how Herod supported the representative kings of the north and south. So here's where kings of north and south come back in. This helps us to understand that this king that's arrogant is not one of them. It says in verse 40, "At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him with a whirlwind, with chariots, and horsemen with many ships. And he shall come into countries, and shall overflow and pass through. He shall come into the glorious land," referring to the promised land, "and tens of thousands shall fall, but these shall be delivered out of his hand, Edom and Moab, and the main part of the Ammonites. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and of silver, and all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train." So this brings us into history. We know it's the time period when Herod the Great was ruling over the Jewish people, because the king of the north and the south that he's talking about, the one who came over the north, was Octavian, who became known as Caesar Augustus. Yes, the Caesar Augustus in Luke chapter 2 of the Christmas story. His son, Tiberius, was mentioned in Luke chapter 3, still the time of Christ. And so we see that they were coming through the north. They were the ones who ultimately represented the power and authority of Rome. But the king of the south was Mark Antony. We talk about Cleopatra and Mark Antony in history, and we see all these Hollywood portrayals of them and their love for one another. We know how they fought together, and they brought the Egyptian army together, some of the Roman loyal to Mark Antony together, and they opposed Octavian. Well, notice how it talks about the king of the north was going to just conquer thousands of people. Ultimately, he brought his forces against the people in the promised land in that middle territory. He fought against Moab and Edom and those who were east of Jerusalem. But he also came and conquered Egypt. So we have a timeline. What is being talked about here? It isn't some future Antichrist. It is that time when Rome is really rising to power and beginning to establish itself even in the promised land. And so when it says here that these things were going to take place, King Herod was known historically to have thrown his hat in with the king of the south to start with. He was friends with Mark Antony. The problem was he hated Cleopatra. I love studying history and how it goes together with Scripture. But he hated Cleopatra because Cleopatra wanted Jerusalem. He wanted the territory that belonged to him. So he tried to buy his time while he could. So he wanted to appease his friend. He wanted to remain in good standing with the king and queen of the south. So he fought against the Arabians to be able to help protect their Egyptian borders. And as a result, he got to keep his territory. But then it says the king of the north came through. So when Octavian came through, now instead of throwing his support behind the king of the south, he says, well, I see where the cards are going to fall. This is the man who's going to rule everything. He is going to be Caesar over Rome. So we're told in history, when he came into the promised land, guess who's there to greet him with open arms? King Herod the Great. And so he threw his lot in with King Herod, with Octavian, and we know from history this is how he was able to continue to have his ability to rule over the Jewish people in Jerusalem. So again, we see those connections to the New Testament. After Octavian came back to Rome with the goods that he conquered from Egypt, just like Daniel was told, that is when they gave him that title that he became that emperor, that Caesar Augustus. And so again, we see that connection to the New Testament and to the time of Jesus Christ. Well, the last thing we read about this king, this arrogant king, is found in Daniel 11, verses 44 through 45, and we'll close with this passage. It says, "But news from the east and the north shall alarm him. And he shall go out with great fury to destroy and devote many things to destruction. And he shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. So we're still talking about the king, opposed to the king of the north, the king of the south. This is King Herod the Great. Notice what it says. He says there's going to be terrible news that's going to just ruffle his feathers. Notice where the first news comes from. It comes from the east. Well, we're getting ready to enter the Thanksgiving season and then the Christmas season. What kind of news came from the east? And who brought it? The wise men came from the east. There were those wise men, those magi who came from the east, and they came. And what was their question? Where is he that is born? King of the Jews. And so all of a sudden, Daniel's told that this king is going to get bad news as far as he's concerned from the east. And so the wise men came from the east. Why? Because they saw the star in the sky. They knew the Old Testament prophecies about the coming of Messiah. And so they come to worship Jesus as the newborn King of Kings. Well, he was the king. He did ruthless things to his family to stay the king. He was actually pretty paranoid about it. But yet, all of a sudden, when this news came, we know from Scripture, from Matthew chapter 2, that he freaked out about it. Who's this born king of the Jews? I don't know. I'm the king of the Jews. So he talked to those that were supposed to know the Jewish things. What's going on? What are they talking about? Oh, the Messiah has been born, huh? Okay, well, where is he at? Because I want to worship him too. So you go find him and then you come tell me. So it was bad news. He played it off. He just wanted to use the wise men so they could go find Jesus and then come back and tell me so I can go kill him. I don't really want to worship him. But we see that news came from the east. And so ultimately, when he wasn't able to define specifically who this king of the Jews was, he made that rule. He brought destruction on many. What Daniel's told is going to happen after this news from the east and the north come. And that's when he signed the death sentence for all those toddlers and babies that were males, trying to hopefully spread a big enough net to kill Jesus. Well, the news from the north, representative of Rome, actually was one of his sons. We can kind of understand why he was a little paranoid. He found out that one of his sons had written a letter that his other sons were lying about him, trying to cause problems between him and Rome. And so when he actually, not just interrogated, but according to what the Scripture said, after he tortured his son Antipater, he found out who the sons that wrote the false lies in a letter to Rome were, and he put those two sons to death. So again, he gets news that's not beneficial for him. What's his first thought? I got to put an end to this. I'm going to kill all the babies. I'm going to kill my kids because I want to rule and I want to reign and I don't want to give up my power. And so the news came from the north. It came from the east. He did terrible things to try to bring destruction to keep his power. But then the final, or the last two things, it says he would set up these palatial tents. One of the things he was known for was his work project. He designed some of the greatest palaces of that time period. He had a palace in two parts of Jerusalem. One of them was attached to the temple, had a secret entrance to the temple. They were beautiful, magnificent buildings, but he also had the temple rebuilt to try and gain favor of the Jewish people who did not like him. He represented Rome. He did not represent the way of the Old Testament, the way of God. And ultimately, the historian Josephus tells us in his older age, he literally wasted away suffering from convulsions. There was no one found to be able to help stem the progression of his disease. And in fact, when no one was able to help him and he knew he was going to die, history reveals that he was so concerned about himself that he gave an order that certain Jewish officials that the people liked would be put to death when he died, just so that the Jewish people would mourn when he died. Not that they would mourn him, but they would be in mourning because of the death that had taken place, so that at least the people were in mourning when he finally died. Yes, ma'am. So when we think about this, that's why I say, we have to look at the bigger picture. Sometimes we have to do a little bit more digging and just say, well, this person said this or this person said that. You know, when we think about the bigger picture, the teaching that we see about Herod the Great actually lines up detail by detail, and it continues that chronological history leading up to the birth of Christ. Next week, Lord willing, we're going to finish up in chapter 12, and we're going to see how that comes to an end. He keeps saying these things have to take place before that indignation against the Jewish people comes to an end. With the birth of Christ, that indignation came to an end. That new way of hope and grace of salvation was going to be made available. So we're going to see how all these things were all pointing forward in time. But Daniel said, I want to know what's going to happen to my people. I'm fasting about it. Lord, you've shown me some terrible things, some good things, but I just want to know what's going to happen. He says, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. So all these things are backed up by history outside of Scripture, but where did they come first? They came through that vision, and Daniel recorded it. These are the things God said was going to happen. And as we look to history, it doesn't disprove God. Instead, it does just the opposite. It shows us how those very things that God said were going to happen took place leading up to the coming of the Messiah. Well, we're going to leave it there. We'll finish up next week, Lord willing. And like I said, after that, we're going to take a break from studying the Old Testament, kind of, sort of. We're going to go to the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, but what we see is that constant bridge. The book of Hebrews is really... I kind of wish the book of Hebrews was actually at the beginning of the New Testament, because it gives us a perfect bridge between the Old Testament and Jesus Christ. Makes sense where it's at, because you got to know about Jesus for it to make sense what he's talking about. But you know, it's that perfect bridge to understand, here's what happened in the Old Testament, here's why God allowed these things to shadow what was going to happen from Christ into the church age. And so it helps us to make that bridge, to be able to bridge the gap between the things that God allowed to happen and why God chose to do certain things he did,